Good afternoon, and welcome to the second installment of our new speaker series, Safe at Home at the Center for New American Security. I'm Carrie Cordero. The Safe at Home series is intended to bring greater attention to the safety and security issues that affect Americans on a daily basis. As democracy is under strain in many parts of the world, it's important that we regularly and deliberately highlight how democracy is delivering for people in their daily lives. One of the things that it must deliver is a reasonable degree of safety and security. So throughout this year, throughout this series, we're going to talk about the challenges to homeland security, such as international and domestic terrorism, political violence against government officials, pandemic preparedness and response, climate-related emergency management, and even mass shootings and drug trafficking, which are not usually things that are part of the national security conversation. This series throughout the year will dive deep into efforts that policymakers, leaders, and operators at the federal level and all across the country are engaging in to protect the country consistent with our laws and values. To further this conversation on a topic that can touch any American at any time, today I'm delighted to welcome Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator Deanne Criswell. I want to share a few items in Administrator Criswell's background to welcome her to our conversation today. Administrator Criswell was unanimously confirmed by the Senate in April 2021 as the 12th administrator of FEMA. She is also the first woman to be confirmed to serve as administrator, and she brings with her to FEMA over 27 years of experience at all levels of emergency management in both government and the private sector. Most recently, before joining in this current capacity, she was the commissioner of the New York City Emergency Management Department from 2019 to 2021, which notably also covers the intense periods of the COVID-19 pandemic. She began her career in emergency management in Aurora, Colorado, and she has previously served in FEMA as one of the leaders of the agency's National Incident Management Assistance Teams and as a federal coordinating officer. As I mentioned, she's also served in the private sector, and she served for 21 years in the Colorado Air National Guard. She is a veteran of 2 overseas tours, to include as a fire officer in Kuwait immediately following the attacks of September 11th, and to Qatar in support of Operation Enduring Freedom in 2010. Administrator Criswell, I'm so grateful to have you join us here today. Administrator Criswell is a former firefighter, a national manager, a leader in a field where operational experience on the ground throughout the country and all around the world really matters. She is the real deal. So welcome.
Thank you, Carrie. It's such an honor to be here today.
Before I bring Administrator Criswell and we start our conversation, I want to make a few notes for our virtual audience today. This conversation is being carried live, and it's live streamed on CNAS's website and on our social media channels. On our website, throughout the conversation, you can feel free to enter questions for me and the administrator. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022 or enter questions into the chat box. Our team, our communications team, will make sure that I see those questions, and I will be looking to incorporate them throughout the conversation. So please, no need for you to wait until the end of the conversation to ask a question. Feel free to send them in as we are talking, and I will work them into our discussion. So Administrator Criswell, I want to start out with a few statistics that represents various issues that Americans have been dealing with both this past year and in recent years that affect them at home in their communities in a way that's different, I think, than some other national security threats that those of us in this space work on. One is the pandemic. We are now tragically nearing 1 million American deaths from the pandemic in the last 2 years. We are aware that there could be a variant that's on the horizon. On a more positive trend, according to the CDC, over 81% of Americans age 5 and up have received one dose of vaccine, and nearly 70% ages 5 and up are fully vaccinated. When it comes to natural disasters, in Administrator Criswell's letter accompanying the new 2022 to 26 strategic plan for FEMA, she noted in that letter that FEMA managed 108 disasters a year about a decade ago, and currently that number is over 300 disasters a year. In 2021, there were 20 weather or climate-related disasters, which is far more than the average over the last 30 years. And we all observed a recent example, which was the December 21 tornado in Mayfield, Kentucky, which was just devastating. So over 80 people at this point have been identified as having died from that tornado, and their homes, workplaces, places of worship, all destroyed. I'll mention one more, wildfires. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, 2021 was not the most dangerous fire year, but one statistic that did catch my eye was that there seemed to be more acres per fire that are burning. As a layperson, I think what that means is that the severity of particular fires may be increasing. And 2020, based on the statistics, looks to have been the most recent, very dangerous year. It was the most on record in terms of acres burned and acres burned per fire. So, Administrator Criswell, coming to you, my question for you is, given these alarming statistics and these wide ranges of emergencies and challenges facing the country, from where you sit in your position, how safe are Americans at home?
Well, Carrie, the statistics and the information that you just provided demonstrates the increased risk that Americans are facing across the country. But what I can tell you is that at FEMA, we have over 22,000 employees who have answered the call to this nation to help keep people safe before, during, and after disasters. And as we continue to see the threat from these disasters and weather-related events continue to change and evolve, we're also looking at the emerging threats that we're seeing from the pandemic, as you mentioned, or homelessness that many of our local emergency managers are facing. We have to stay ahead of what these emerging threats and these emerging risks and hazards might be so we can better protect communities.
Thanks for that. So I want to focus, one of the things when I was preparing for today is looking at the fact that, and I want to focus on pandemic response, both taking a little bit of a look back, but then even more importantly, looking forward in terms of how we envision FEMA's role going ahead when it comes to pandemic. But I couldn't help but see that you were commissioner for New York City Emergency Management from 2019 to 2021, which included 2020, where there was such an intense lockdown in New York and great suffering in New York due to the pandemic. Can you just share with us what that was like during that environment from your emergency management leadership perspective, having been served in New York during that time?
Yeah, Carrie, I mean, as you stated, I started in July of 2019, and it was just 6 months later that we actually started planning for the pandemic. My first communication with the commissioner for the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene was in the first week of January. And we had our first tabletop exercise to kind of game out what we thought might happen just a few weeks later. I will say, and I've said this to others, that year was certainly one of the hardest years of my entire professional career. We were experiencing things that, I've often said that, I like to write really hard exercises. And these are some of the things that I would never even have thought of putting in an exercise, the scale and the magnitude of what we were facing. And we were at the epicenter, right? We were at the very beginning of what this pandemic and what we're seeing today. And there was a lot that we were learning along the way. We did not know, how fragile this virus was going to be and how it was going to spread. And so the advice that we were giving had to continually evolve to make sure that as we learned more about this virus, we were giving the appropriate information for individuals to protect themselves and their families. But what I will say is in New York City, we came together. The city really stood up, not just the employees of the city, which really, went above and beyond to put programs in place to make sure that nobody went hungry in New York City, that we prevented the collapse of a healthcare system, that we were providing the resources that were needed to keep communities safe, schools safe, and so forth. But it was the citizens that really stood up. All of those New Yorkers that were out there, they did their part, and they made the biggest difference in how we were able to reach that first bend and come back down from the initial surge of COVID-19.
So you mentioned how it had to, obviously the pandemic has had to be something where both the health management community and the emergency response community have had to constantly be adapting for what the role is. And it has all changed for all of us in our lives, as well as for those who have a professional responsibility for managing it. So then you came over to FEMA in the spring of 2021. And
Right.
During 2021, so this has obviously been a very different, 2021 was a different phase of the pandemic versus your experience in New York in 2020. So can you talk about in 2021, what was the role then of FEMA? My understanding is that there was some role in terms of vaccine, but can you tell our viewers what FEMA's role has been in particular, sort of for the last calendar year or so?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'll give a call out to our workforce because right from the beginning, before I got there, that year before, they showed up, our workforce showed up each and every day to make sure that our communities had the resources that they needed through the darkest days of the pandemic. And they continued to display the resilience and the perseverance needed to help meet the response needs that our communities were facing. This is the first time in our history, the COVID-19, that we actually had a presidential disaster declaration for every state, territory, and the District of Columbia at the same time. And so what that means is that it was an all hands on deck effort across all of our 10 regional offices, as well as our headquarters staff. And they have done some amazing things. So far to date, we've been able to give out over $42 billion in funding to support states and local jurisdictions for costs such as medical care or vaccination and testing efforts, the things that they've needed to make sure that they could open safely or expand medical centers. Really, truly has been amazing. But you mentioned the vaccines, and that was one of the things that President Biden had asked FEMA to do shortly before I got here, to make sure that we could do whatever we needed to do to make sure that every American had the ability to get vaccinated. I was saying in New York City before I left, and I continued to say it here, that vaccinations was a shared responsibility, and we had to bring everybody together to be able to make sure we had that available. And there wasn't a playbook for this, right? There was no kind of set plan for how to scale up a mass vaccination effort to this level, to this scale. And so what we were able to do is develop a plan and a playbook that outlined how many personnel would be needed and what type of equipment and facilities would need to be used in order to support our states and local jurisdictions across the country. And we also wanted to make sure that we were reaching out to those that were most vulnerable, those that had not as much access to vaccinations. And so in the end, we were able to stand up 39 mass vaccination sites, and this was across 27 states, and included delivering over 5.6 million vaccinations across these sites. But that's just what the federal family did. And I would like to also emphasize that on the federal family, this wasn't just FEMA that did this, right? We brought in our partners. The Department of Defense was a huge partner in this. Health and Human Services, great partner in this. Army Corps of Engineers, partner in the earlier phase when we were expanding hospitals. It was truly an all of government effort to try to reach out to Americans. Some of the other things, though, that we did to support this vaccination mission is grants to states and local jurisdictions to help them. And so we gave out over $1 billion in grants in the first 10 days to help spur this vaccination mission. And then we delivered supplies and additional personnel or funding to an additional 2,200 community vaccination sites across the country. So as state and locals were setting up their vaccination centers, we were giving them the resources that they needed to make sure that they were able to operate. And so in the end, I mentioned we were looking at social vulnerability and trying to make sure we got to communities that needed the access. You know, the one thing that we have seen with COVID-19 is that it disproportionately impacted our communities of color. And so at the federal vaccination sites, because of this deliberate effort, 58.1% of all of the doses that we administered went to people of color. And so a huge success across the federal mission, and then our continued support to state and local jurisdictions.
You mentioned the role of the Department of Defense. And so one thing FEMA, my understanding is that FEMA has highlighted the National Guard's role in particular in COVID-19 response. That is under an authority that is called Title 32, as I understand, which is a federal funding and state control. I know that you have deep experience as a 21-year veteran of the Colorado National Guard. Is that Title 32 authority and use of the National Guard, is that something that is going to continue over the long term? Or is that something that was just sort of to address this acute issue that required assistance in this way?
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredible tool and a resource, right? The National Guard, we couldn't have done this mission without our National Guard members. They have been instrumental in all phases of this pandemic, and they continue to be instrumental in helping states and local jurisdictions respond and recover from this. The Title 32 authority is a funding authority through the Department of Defense, but where FEMA comes in is we were able to reimburse states for their Title 32 assets, National Guard assets, which was an incredible opportunity to help them continue to use those resources to support their response. During natural disasters, we typically don't reimburse when they activate their National Guard under Title 32 status. But we wanted to make sure that they had the flexibility to use their National Guard to support their operations. And so therefore we were reimbursing, and we're continuing to reimburse National Guard right now through July 1st of this year.
Okay, great. And so tell me, so I want to shift our conversation from pandemic to climate in a minute, but before we do that, so how then have these different phases of the pandemic affected how you think about FEMA's role in the future, either if COVID-19, if we were to have another surge with respect to this pandemic, or much longer over the horizon, another pandemic? How have the past 2 years informed what long range thinking FEMA is doing in terms of what its role would be in the future?
Yeah, I think that we have learned so much from our response to this pandemic, and we're capturing a lot of that and how we want to make sure that we have a solid foundation for the future. I think, everybody recognizes that, the pandemics that we see, we will see another one, right? This isn't going to be the last one. They come in different types of magnitude, and this certainly being the largest pandemic that we've ever faced. I think right now, over the next 2 years, if I was thinking about what we're going to do, is it's still been a very dynamic virus, right? And it still causes surges across our medical system, our healthcare system. And so we want to make sure that we are continue to be able to support our hospitals if they have continued surges. And we are still supporting a few hospitals right now, primarily in our territories with additional staff, because they're still experiencing some surges from the pandemic. And we're going to continue to reimburse our jurisdictions for the costs that they have incurred to open and operate and for all of their response operations. And so we're working closely with them to make sure that we're reimbursing everything that they put in place to help keep their citizens safe. And I think the other thing that we're doing, and you mentioned in your opening remarks that, we're almost at the 1 million mark of those that have lost their life to COVID-19. And we were able to put in place our funeral assistance program to help take away some of that burden. And we just passed the $2 billion mark. But we want to make sure that we continue to provide this kind of resource, and we want people to know that it's available. So we're doing targeted outreach to reach out to communities and let individuals know that if they have suffered a loss, that we do have a program that can help them at least with the financial impact of that loss.
Thank you for that. So I want to switch gears, Administrator Criswell, and talk about climate and climate weather-related disasters that FEMA responds to and coordinates and provides assistance to state and local and tribal responders all around the country for those type of events. As a layperson, observing these kinds of events, it seems to me that every time there is damage done from a hurricane or a tornado or some weather-related event, there is immediately kind of a debate in the public sphere about, is this climate change related or not? And I'm curious, from your perspective, how is that assessment done as to whether or not a particular discrete weather-related disaster is climate change related? And then from your perspective as a responder or someone providing assistance to prepare, does it really matter whether or not the event is climate change related versus a weather event?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think it does matter, but I think it matters on our ability to make sure that we are able to look at what types of events we are going to face in the future. Whether an individual event is climate related or not is not going to impact our ability to respond. But what it is doing is it's creating more complex recoveries. And so what we want to be able to do is let the scientists out there come back and look at, is this something that was related to climate change? And more importantly, then, what can we expect in the future that will continue to increase so we can better reduce the impacts that we're seeing from that event. So we've done a lot of work. We've always done a lot of work on making sure that we're building our plans based on historical risk. But we have to actually change our focus right now. And we have to start thinking about what the future risks are going to be. And the best way to do that is to understand each event, right? And to go back and look at each individual event and see, is this something that has been made worse as a result of climate change? And is it going to continue to get worse? And if so, how can we help communities reduce the impact that they're seeing from these risks so they can better protect their communities?
Mm-hmm. So the Secretary Mayorkas released a quite ambitious climate action plan for the department in the fall, and FEMA has a key role in incorporating, as you're describing, climate adaptation into the national preparedness and grants and projects. So can you point us to a few things just as a practical matter, that how are you one of the questions with strategic plan, those of us in the policy space focus on strategic plans, and FEMA itself, as we've discussed, has a new strategic plan. How are you operationalizing what both that climate action plan and your strategic planning, what does that mean as a practical matter for FEMA?
Yeah, so, I think, I'll start with, when people think about FEMA, they typically think about our ability to respond and then recover from these events. And then when we think about the emergency management sequence of events or the cycle, we often talk about response. We'll start with preparedness. We talk about preparedness, response, recovery, and then mitigation often comes at the end of that conversation. And so in our strategic plan, the one thing that we're focused on is pulling that mitigation piece and putting it right up front. If we don't start to shift our thinking away from the response and recovery being the primary mission that we're doing, we're never going to reduce the impacts. And so our focus, and what you read in the Secretary's Climate Action Plan, is how do we help get out there and help educate communities about what their risk is, what their future risk might be, and how we can help them reduce the impact of that risk. We're really excited that last year, President Biden, he provided us with close to $5 billion to support our mitigation programs. And this is more funding than we've had in many years. And it's also giving us that opportunity to shift our focus away from just an incremental approach to mitigation. We kind of have this spotty approach sometimes, a buyout by buyout, small little projects in communities. And now with this kind of funding, we can actually do system-wide projects, or we can have a place-based focus where we look at a whole community and the types of things that we can do to help increase the resilience of that community. So our focus is, one, educating our communities about what their risk is, and then the actions that they can take to help reduce the impact of that risk.
So I want to hover on this for a minute, because this is a really important point that you're making. And also throughout the conversation, you've referenced several times the grant making function that FEMA has. FEMA has just for our audience, FEMA has a very sizable budget. The last I looked, I believe it's at about $28 billion budget. With 22,000 employees. So what that tells me is that a significant part of what FEMA spends money on is this grant making function. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So one thing that I saw in the budget documents was that after, I believe it was Hurricane Maria, FEMA awarded over $9 billion to help rebuild Puerto Rico, and $9 billion there for electric grid and infrastructure, $2 billion on educational facilities. It seemed, and obviously that is money that should be designated for that purpose, but it seems to me that there is a compelling argument to be made that grant making might be more effective at this preparedness and mitigation stage that you're describing, the more proactive, because aren't the costs going to be a lot higher on the cleanup and the repair end? Talk to me about how you think about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The studies that are out there is that every dollar invested in mitigation saves, what the latest is, I think, $8 in recovery costs. And so the dollars that you're talking about are the recovery costs, right? Those are the things that when a community gets awarded a presidential disaster declaration, a major disaster declaration, those are the grants that help them rebuild after those disasters. And it goes back to that same part of my conversation as we think about what FEMA does in the response and the recovery, but we have to put a lot more emphasis on, you're absolutely right, on the preparedness and the mitigation side. And that's why this administration has put forth so much additional funding, again, close to $5 billion last year alone in the mitigation piece of it. Now, some of that mitigation funding that we have does come post-disaster, right? And so when we look at a disaster, a certain percentage of the funding is given through what's called our Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is post-disaster funding. But they can use it for anything. They can use it. It doesn't have to be mitigating something that was necessarily damaged by that event. They can use it for anything across their community to help increase their resilience. And for the first time since 9/11, we actually gave out this type of funding for all of the COVID-19 declarations. As I said earlier, this is the first time that we've had all 50 states and territories get a presidential disaster declaration. And so we were able to give this hazard mitigation grant program funding to all of those COVID-19 disaster declarations. So it's only the first time, and let me make sure I was clear, it's only the first time since 9/11 that we've done it for a non-natural disaster. We did do the same thing for 9/11, but this gave us flexibility to give funding out to communities through a pandemic declaration to help increase their resiliency to future natural hazard events. But the pre-side is what's so important too, right? And that's why our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, or our BRIC grant, as everybody calls it, is all about pre-disaster, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to wait for the disaster to happen. This is funding that Congress has appropriated. The first year was 500 million. We doubled it last year to $1 billion. This is funding that we want communities to use ahead of a disaster to help increase their resilience. And then this is also funding that in our previous version of this program, communities, the federal share was only $5 million. Those are small projects. When I talk about incremental, those are small projects when we're talking about the type of work that needs to be done to make resilient infrastructure.
Mhm.
This program, the BRIC program, it's a $50 million limit, which gives us so much more flexibility to really do those system-wide projects.
Right, right. Thank you for explaining that, because I think the grant making piece, and especially to the extent that people who are thinking a lot about the climate related effects, this proactive grant making seems to have be the right thing to do, both from the perspective of preparing communities so that they are not damaged, but there also, I think, is a financial case to be made for it as well. Administrator Criswell, I want to switch gears again a little bit here and talk about the workforce. You've peppered our conversation so far with the workforce. You know that here at Center for American Security, we are very focused on growing the next generation of national security and homeland security leaders and practitioners and policymakers. And so when we think about responding to flooding, when we think about responding to fires and other disasters, when we think about the management and the leadership piece and the expertise that is needed to address the wide range of emergency response issues, we need a workforce that is prepared and educated and trained on these specific issues. At CNAS, I see a lot of resumes of young people who are interested in public service, who are interested in world affairs. They are smart, they are educated, they are diverse, and they are looking for opportunities to serve. So what would you say to encourage them to consider and look towards a career in emergency management?
So, I mean, I got to start by saying I am so passionate about this profession, about the emergency management profession. It's still a fairly young discipline and one that continues to grow, but one that continues to demonstrate the value that it brings to the table. And so when I think about talking about the next generation of emergency managers, I ask the question, do you want to solve tough problems that are out there? Do you want to apply critical thinking skills? Do you want to be engaged in a variety of different types of topics, that keep you interested and help expand your professional growth? And so those are the kind of things that I think emergency managers bring to the table. I think that we have such a unique skill set of solving tough problems. And this is why we're not just focused on disaster response, right? We are given problem sets like the pandemic. Our local emergency managers are given problem sets like responding to homelessness. But we also have the pre-side, right, that you and I just talked about. We have those people that want to think about how to make this world better through mitigation, how to make it more resilient through mitigation. Or on our preparedness side, right, the social science side of what we do, right? How do we help people better understand the things that they can do to be better prepared so they can protect their family? I think there's just so many different varieties of ways that emergency managers support their communities, which means it gives a lot of flexibility and it gives a lot of opportunity for growth. And so I'm really excited about this next generation of emergency managers that are coming to the table, because they're going to bring these new creative perspectives. And I think it's just going to continue to help our profession grow.
So what are some practical examples of programs or initiatives that you have at FEMA or at DHS? And I'll give you an example in another context. Some part of the Center for New American Security community of interest, and folks who might be watching us today are heavily involved in the cybersecurity side of things. There's a program, for example, at NSA that has National Centers of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity. So there's been this project that has been implemented to try to build a pipeline of academic institutions that are partners in training and educating next generation of cybersecurity practitioners. Is there anything that you can point to as a practical matter sort of along those lines that is an initiative of FEMA or something you'd like to do that will help grow and train and educate this emergency management workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is a young discipline, right? And so it's a really exciting time to be an emergency manager. When I started in this career field, we didn't have higher education either. We did not have undergraduate or graduate programs that focused on emergency management, on crisis management. It was always it was my master's is in public administration with an emphasis in crisis management. But we have that now. We have undergraduate and graduate programs that are really getting people interested in what this career can bring. But I am really excited to talk about some of the work that our Emergency Management Institute is going to do. And we have just launched our first Vanguard program, which is a program for our executives, our emergency management executives across the country, to be able to come together and talk about our profession and ways we can continue to grow the profession and also recruit additional people from the ground up, right? We want to reach individuals at high school and colleges and say, hey, this is a great career. And so as we start to see this growth within the academic areas, we're also now trying to bring together the executive levels to continue to advance the profession and demonstrate the value that emergency managers bring.
And I know part of that effort is to make sure that you're bringing in a wider range of the community to be involved in this field. One of the things that struck me in your new strategic plan was that goal number 1 of the strategic plan for FEMA is to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. And my sense of that, you tell me, but my sense of that is that there's a workforce piece of that, and then there's a serving communities piece of that. So can you share with our audience how you think about operationalizing that aspect of the strategic plan as it relates to equity and inclusion?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it's a really important part of my vision when I came into the agency, and I'm happy to see how it's evolved through the development of our strategic plan. We really have 3 goals within our strategic plan, and they focus on different things. And so our first goal focuses on our workforce. Our second goal focuses on our programs. And then our third goal focuses on how we're going to deliver our services to individuals and to people and communities. So when I think about the workforce, I think about how do we build a workforce that is reflective of the communities that we serve. I think that the best way that we can improve our programs and deliver services, the other 2 goals or objectives, is by having a workforce that understands the people that we're serving, right? They understand the kinds of needs that individuals have or communities have. And so I think that by creating this diverse workforce is incredibly important to better represent the communities that we're helping. The second part of it is our programs, right? We have seen through the years that many of our programs have had disproportionate impacts on communities, not by design deliberately, but as we have continued to evolve them, we see many of our underserved communities that are having struggles trying to access our programs. And so one of the things that we are focused on is how do we remove the barriers that our programs may have from those that need our assistance the most. And so we focused last year on a few key policy changes to help with that. One of them was air rights. I don't know if you know, and many of your viewers may know, but some properties and some individuals have property that has been handed down through the generations, yet they don't always have the typical documentation that one would have to show that they have home ownership. And so we made a few policy changes to help better address this issue, right? So we could accept different types of documentation. And we did that before we went into hurricane season last year, and we had great results. It resulted in almost 42,000 additional people being able to receive assistance from us that in the past would have been denied. Mm-hmm. And then we made different policy changes about how do you prove your occupancy when people just don't have have the normal paperwork and they don't have traditional lease agreements. And so that policy change resulted in almost 53,000 more individuals getting assistance. And so when I think about equity in programs, I want to make sure that we understand what the barriers communities and people have into accessing our programs. And I think just real quickly, the third one on delivering our assistance, I think about this and when we talk about our grant programs, about making sure that communities understand what kind of resources are out there to help them and that we reach out to them. We know where communities need help and that we provide them directed technical assistance to help them navigate this federal bureaucracy that we have and get the assistance that they need to improve the safety and resilience of their communities.
Administrator Criswell, in the remaining time that we have left, I want us to look ahead. You've done a great job in terms of explaining to us what many of the new policies and practices that you're working to implement in the near term. But as I've studied DHS over the years, one thing that has struck me in the department's history is that there can be initiatives and there can be policy changes that are the priorities of a particular component head or of the secretary, him or herself. But then if those changes are not baked into legislation, they can unfortunately either be lessened or not priorities anymore, or kind of wash away, and some progress can be lost depending on just sort of what's going on at the particular time in the department. So let's hover for a few remaining minutes left on Congress. And most legislation, as I understand it, as it relates to FEMA, has been reactive. It has been in reaction to a particular event, like a Sandy, like a Katrina, that then causes Congress to act and amend FEMA's authorities. What are some things that you would like to see taken up from a legislative perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you made is spot on, right? There are many things that we can do within policy, a couple of the examples that I just gave that can make some immediate impacts, but some of the changes do need legislative action. And so for us, we want to make sure that we are always examining how we can first improve our policies and processes to make sure that we're helping those people that need our help. But second, we want to stay in close touch with our partners on the Hill. You know, we have a legislative agenda that of things that we want to change that we think can have significant impacts in the way we deliver our programs. And so by staying in close contact with our partners on the Hill, that way we can take timely action on things that are going to help us become more resilient or help us become the FEMA that our nation needs and deserves.
And what's one or two things that would help you get ahead of the next disaster, as opposed to Congress taking up the legislation after the fact?
Yeah, I mean, a couple that I can talk about, right? And not everything we can talk about as it's going through the process, but there's a couple right now that I think that we can talk about. And one, we talked about our workforce, right? And so one of the things that Congress is currently considering is providing USERRA type protection for our FEMA reservists. And so for those of you who don't know, USERRA type protection is something that the reservists and the National Guard have in the military, which means if they have another job and they get activated and deployed, they have their job waiting for them when they get back. And so that's something our current reservists don't have. And so because the reservists are the backbone of what we do at FEMA, they represent the majority of our workforce, and we just simply couldn't respond without them. This type of protection, it's going to give us a different way to recruit and build our workforce to be able to respond to this increased level of responses and natural disasters that we're seeing. And if you have time for one more, I mean, there's one. Yes, one last one, really important right now, is this long-term reauthorization that we have been seeking for our National Flood Insurance Program. I don't know if many people realize this, but the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, it is the nation's largest flood insurance program, and it provides nearly $1.3 trillion in coverage. But for years now, the NFIP has only been reauthorized through a series of really short-term extensions. And so it's really overdue for this long-term reauthorization. So we're working really closely right now with the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee to help put this long-term reauthorization in process, which I think is going to completely transform our flood insurance program. And so I'm extremely grateful for the working relationship that we have with Congress, and particularly our committees of jurisdiction, because without their support, we wouldn't be able to continue to help people and improve the way that we help people.
Okay, well, hopefully those are things that they will take up proactively, as much of work that you are doing at FEMA is now geared toward. Administrator Criswell, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk through all of these issues with us, and for bringing your expertise and your knowledge to the CNAS community in the national security and homeland security space. So thank you so much. Great to speak with you, and appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks so much, Carrie. I appreciate the discussion today.